my name is Mark Hobra, and today on This Is Vinyl, we're going to be talking to another old friend of mine, this guy called Ben Wardle. Ben used to run Indolent Records, home of bands like Sleeper, the iconic Stephen Duffy, 60 Foot Dolls, Wanna Dies, and prior to that was at East West Records. But he's an avid vinyl collector and someone that I found would be really interesting to speak to regarding the whole genre that is vinyl and vinyl collecting, but also a little bit about our shared past within the music industry. So here we go with Ben Wardle. I hope you enjoy it. I have the great privilege to sit here with Mr. Ben Wardle, who is an old friend of mine from back in the day, something that Mike Smith called the Britpop Wars.
Yes.
But Ben, tell me a little bit about, because I know some of this, but people that might want to listen to this don't. So where did you start within in the music industry? I mean, what give us a few of your highlights, and then I want to ask you about your vast record collection.
In the music industry, I started in the very late 80s, early 90s as a talent scout for East West Records, who at the time I think were still WEA, which stood for Warner Electro Atlantic. Vinyl Junkies out there, and it was a lovely place to work because it was at the time. I'm going to turn this very quickly to vinyl. The Warners manufactured all their records in a German town called Alsdorf, and so every week, there would be fabulous new releases coming through. Whether it was the big American acts like we had Geffen at the time, so all the Guns N' Roses stuff, Tracy Chapman, Jane's Addiction. Not to speak of the sort of bands from the past that I was kind of ordering up and getting big batches of to just basically discover all the music that I missed out on as a student because I couldn't afford it, and I had sort of 3 REM LPs and Rattlesnakes by Lloyd Cole and the Commotions.
Yeah.
So I was actually working for the man who'd signed Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, Malcolm Dunbar, who was a sort of very opinionated Roxy Music fan who had a great A&R career, signed Lloyd Cole, signed Julian Cope, signed the Christians, and had come along to Warner's to head up the A&R department there, and had just had a huge hit with Tracy Chapman. We always used to joke that he only ever signed artists who looked a bit like Lloyd Cole, because he then went on to sign The Big Dish, the singer of which looked a bit like Lloyd. I think when you go, basically he just wanted to sign Brian Ferry. That would have been his dream. He was very, very keen on Suede as well, as you can imagine. So I worked there for a couple of years. I signed up. The first thing that I had to do as a talent scout, I was sent to Dublin because the biggest band in the world at that point were U2, and so everyone wanted to find the next U2. So I was kind of sent off to Dublin, where I'd never been to Ireland before in my life. I'd sent off there to find the next U2, which I did. I did find the next U2. Unfortunately, they weren't quite as successful as the original U2, but they were very much in the mold of U2. So much so that they were called Unemotional Fish, incredibly unpromising name, and they were managed by someone who was a friend of Paul McGuinness, U2's manager, and they were recording at Wimmill Lane. They had the same guy called Steve Averill, who did all the U2 artwork, was doing their artwork. They were completely in the U2 camp, and I just stumbled across them as a sort of hapless scout. Someone tipped me off about them, so I was first on this band who ended up becoming the source of a massive record company bidding war, which resulted in pretty much every single major label flying over to Dublin on a weekly basis to buy the band, and Aidan Cosgrave, the manager, increasingly swollen lunches. And it got to the point where we actually had to fly over Arma Ertigan from Atlantic to kind of press the flesh in order to convince them to sign to us, which they did in the end. But meanwhile, while all this was going on, we were all kind of when you think the sort of major label giants gently stalking the next U2. Meanwhile, all the kind of indies and the slightly more stealthy and nimble labels were getting excited about Manchester and shoegazing. So yeah, by the time that and Emotional Fish got round to releasing their debut, Manchester had happened and the goalposts had moved sufficiently to render anything that sounded like Rattle and Hum redundant. But yeah, that was where I started. I then went off and worked for RCA, and realized the importance of context for for indie music, which is what I gravitated towards, guitar music, and how important in the early 90s that you were not kind of seen to be part of the corporate machinery, which, obviously Unemotional Fish had been a prime example of. So I managed to get the go ahead because we had a bit of money at RCA where I was working, because Take That were doing very well. Got a bit of money to start, I think, what became later known as Mandy's, a kind of a major label version of an independently distributed, so we could get into the indie charts. And it's called Indolent, which I got the name out of a Thomas Pynchon book, which is there is a label in their book called Vineland, where apparently they're so stoned that they think that some of the bands that they're signing are from other galaxies. And
Well, we
we
met
signed.
like that.
What's that?
We met A&R guys like that.
Yeah, yeah. We signed Sleeper and Stephen Duffy and the Wonderdizers. We just sort of hit a time when finally the UK music scene was coming a bit out of the doldrums. I mean, I say obviously Manchester and shoegaze was kind of fun, but there was something still quite. Um, it wasn't a game that the major labels were really allowed to take part in. So when Blur finally happened, I mean, at East West, I'd signed a band called 530 who Blur supported, but they were never allowed. They were never part of the kind of Manchester baggy scene which was going on,
Well, yeah.
which was a shame because they had a absolutely dyed in the wool baggy song, but their band were refused to release as their debut, so we never managed to get on that bandwagon, unfortunately.
Yeah.
How much does that 530 record go for? Still not as valuable as it should be, I don't think.
Probably not. I don't know. I have to confess, I haven't seen one coming through the shop. So
Yeah,
until
no, they're not. I saw one in a secondhand shop in Malvern,
yeah,
um, and bought it immediately because it was a bargain. I also bought the debut by Top, who were
oh,
another kind of would-be baggy band.
I signed Top for one single on Lemon
Did
Records.
you?
Yes, yes, and
What was the single? Was it number one Dominator?
no,
Quite
no,
possibly.
it wasn't. It wasn't number one dominant. I'm struggling to remember. Oh God, what was it? Um, I Want You. It was called.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
we released it on 10-inch single.
Mhm.
Had a copy of Man Ray's Wife on the cover. A beautiful cover actually that the band came up with.
Right.
But that was after being dropped by Island because
Oh, I see. So it was the sort of, the
yeah,
top, the revenge.
yeah. So, well, it's because obviously I had Kinky Machine on Lemon Records. It was managed by Mark Lewis, who
Hmm.
I interviewed for this, and uh, they he was obviously managing Top and Kinky Machine. Top lost their deal with Island Records, and he played me this demo, and it was brilliant. I loved it. And so we just did a kind of like, well, look, should we put that out as a single, kind of to see whether we can help the band get
Mm.
another deal somewhere. It did okay, you know. But that was the whole thing about you talking about things being very nimble at that time, because obviously I had Lemon Records, which was half and half associated with MCA, or
Mm.
a subdivision named Oxygen, and so Kinky Machine were technically signed to the major, but again they were released through me, so they could be independently distributed.
Hmm.
Um, and but I could also move quite quickly to get. So I signed Power of Dreams. I made an album with them, and that was they were just that sort of band that weren't quite doing enough on a major label, but actually as
Yeah.
an independent they were doing plenty. So
Mm.
as long as you cut your cloth accordingly. And we immediately kind of made an album and licensed it straight to Japan, and actually we went to Polydor Japan because they were big over there, which paid
Mm.
for everything in the UK. So we kind of got this band album made. We made it in I think 10 days Greenhouse with Jessica Corcoran, uh,
Mhm.
yeah, Pat Collier's studio.
Yes, right, yeah.
Yeah. But
He
yeah,
died a couple of
you
weeks
know,
ago.
he did. Yeah, sadly, and as did Carl from 60 Foot Dolls as well.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, that was one of the could have been contenders on my label Indolent with 60 Foot Dolls. Yeah, I was thinking about Carl over the weekend.
Yeah,
It's his lovely happy face.
yeah.
Um, yeah, he when we signed 60 Foot Dolls, I remember after the band had obviously drunk sufficient amount of booze. Carl then proceeded to try and flush the contract down the loo. I don't think he was doing it out of any negativity towards the label. That was just the kind of guy he was.
Fantastic.
Another quick Carl story though. Well, while we're on 60 Foot Dolls, they were recording their debut at Rockfield, and I pitched up in my A&R trousers halfway through the recordings, and they were kind of quite deep into them. So deep, in fact, that the entire studio was covered with pictures of ladies that they'd torn out of magazines that they quite like the look of. Um, and Carl had an air rifle, which is obviously always good
Well,
to let the drummer loose with an air rifle. As I sat there listening to work in progress, Carl sort of was very meticulously loading it, and then he looked at me and said, "All right, Ben, start running."
God, drummer and air rifle. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, it's very well. What a sweet man, though. Great, lovely guy, and
Quite a successful artist, I think. After
yeah, yeah. I mean, very, very accomplished. I never knew at the time. He must have always had that ability, but he certainly never, he never showed off about it. Yeah.
so, talking about Indolent, I mean, we.
Mm.
I'll pick on one of your bands, Sleeper, because we
Mm.
spent a long time with my company Revolution working a lot of the Sleeper records, possibly all of them. I don't know, but they seemed to transcend an awful lot of areas in the set that they were an independent band, that they could completely compete with the major label artists at the time. They did multiple Top of the Popses. They had, I think,
Mm.
they held the record for the amount of Top of the Pops that they had done at one point. I don't know.
God, I didn't know that.
John telling me, but there again, he may be wrong.
No, he's very good on. He was always very good on statistics and
Because I've
analysis.
been there a lot. But I remember Sleeper because I think they were called Surrender Dorothy before they
Mhm.
were Sleeper. When I was working at Lemon Stroke MCA, there was demos going around and bits going. Obviously, you signed them, but talk me through how you found Sleeper. How did you manage to get that deal done?
Well, it was the they were. You're right to say they were called Surrender Dorothy, and we signed them as Surrender Dorothy. And they were. What I liked about them was Louise's voice, and I thought she looked fantastic as well, and was very convincing on stage. But I mean, I have to say, I don't. I mean, I was going to say I'm shooting myself in the foot here, but I don't really consider myself any pop visionary because of that. I think we were um, the band changed. I think twice after I signed them. I signed them on the strength of a demo tape, which was quite mainstream sounding, and I don't know. And despite the fact it was mainstream sounding, and probably because of the fact it was mainstream sounding, it wouldn't have worked. But we ended up doing a singles deal. My boss let me do a singles deal, partly because the whole idea was to do it through this, um, as I say, this Mandy label. And once they were signed, there was definitely a move within the group to move away. They had a song called "I'll Catch You If." Catch Me If I Fall, I think it was called, or Catch You If I Fall. And then there was a song called Stay, which was a kind of big, sort of romantic, sweeping mid-tempo ballad. Quite, yeah, as I said, quite not the Sleeper that people would know. And and John was very, very into the Pixies, so that influence was coming through at the time because of John, and he was probably the more dominant of the songwriting team at that point. And the first single that we released was very much in that kind of post grunge arena, which was kind of still going on at the time. Britpop was not there was not any Britpop reason to sign them. There was no, such a thing was not to be invented by a journalist until, a year and a half later. So the first EP, Alice in Vain, was really, we deliberately kind of made it underground. The sleeve artwork was the Lou's brother who managed the band, Jeff, found this fantastic, obscure American artist who was at that point, I think, in his late 70s, called, with an amazing name, Ralph Meatyard. And he'd taken these photos of these children with slightly disturbing Halloween masks, just sitting staring at the camera. So we put that on the sleeve and put a color swatch of blue into it, and released it as an EP, calling it the Alice EP. It had a title track, was Alice in Vain, which was very Pixies, if you remember that.
Yeah.
It did end up on the first album, but it sounded quite incongruous, really, along with the other tracks. And then I spent a long time, not deliberately, just because I liked them, and they were just such fantastic company, super bright. They'd been to the same university as me. They'd all been to Manchester, or certainly Lou and John had met at Manchester, and they were just really good and very receptive to ideas. And we talked a lot about, inevitably with me, Elvis Costello and late 70s sort of power pop and new wave. And I'm sure, I'd like to think at least, that had some, Lou had grown up with the Jam and the same sort of, but they were only a tiny bit younger than me. No, I shouldn't say that. They were probably more, 7 years younger than me, but they'd grown up with a similar sort of British guitar music that was so fantastic in the late 70s and early 80s. And that started coming through. So by the time of the second single, Swallow, we were getting a little bit more traction. We got a bit of traction on the Alice EP, some good reviews. Steve Lamacq was a big supporter from the get-go. At that point, he didn't have a radio station. I didn't have a radio show, I don't think.
No,
No,
he probably.
I don't think the evening session was going at that point. It was still Mark Goodyear.
Yeah, yeah, it was not good you at the time. Yeah.
Mm. Um, and then so Swallow was I remember me and the marketing guy, there was a slightly salacious Lou chorus. There he comes, she swallows. That was the chorus, which sounds kind of really quite unnecessarily filthy, but it was a quite clever. The way that she sang it was quite a clever play on words. We didn't, as marketing people, we just did some, if you remember, telephone boxes with those little calling cards in that you could call up a lady of the night. Sounds terribly, this is awful exploitative, but we did lots of cards with the single release on and put them in telephone boxes.
Forgot.
What we were
Yeah, I
thinking.
remember that. Yeah.
Somewhere I've probably got a bunch of these cards that Steve, the marketing man, made. And lots of stickers. I've always been a huge fan of stickers. We did stickers and put them all over, mainly London venues, the Dublin Castle, the Bull and Gate, all of the usual the usual places where they were playing at the time, sort of 100, 200 capacity venues.
That's right.
And then what was the third single? You probably can you remember that? I think the third single was Delicious.
I think it might have been, yeah.
Or was the one before that? I think no, the third single was Delicious, and that I really thought was the hit.
Yeah.
I really thought we're going to crack it now. And obviously we'd done two singles, so at that point we'd extended it to an album deal. I have to say, um, there was. I still feel slightly ashamed that it was a singles deal. That's all I could kind of negotiate from my bosses at the time, but the way that it worked out was very successful. But it would have, if we'd done an album deal from the get-go, they would probably have ended up starting earning royalties earlier. I would have thought. But anyway, third single, it wasn't a hit, even despite the fact that I'd got Ian Brody to produce it, and it didn't quite make it through. And it wasn't until we got to the fourth single, In Betweener, where things started coming together. But those three singles, all of which would, got into the indie charts and were getting play on, the I think at that point, certainly Mark and Lard had their late night show, didn't they? So they were quite loyal to it. And we got some BBC sessions. So we got all of the right quarters that in those days were important to get. A live review in the NME, a kind of on feature by Steve Lamacq in the NME, something in the Melody Maker, an evening session. I don't know whether we did a Goodyear session, but we definitely did I think we did something in Manchester for Mark Radcliffe. And we got a support with the Blue Aeroplanes, which was very exciting. I remember that was like a real foothold. And yeah, people began to dress like her, and by the time In Betweener came out, it was obviously, someone had given the nod to Radio 1 producers, and we were on the proper grown up playlist.
Well, I remember at the time, I mean, we were part of that promo team, I guess, working with help and Steve Lowe's, and Lou always had something to say. I think it was always, she was very, very, still is very, very good when when interviewed, and she had this way of actually cutting through the. I can't even really describe it. It sort of resonated with people. I think a very strong female, fronted, and there wasn't so many of those around at the time, I don't think.
No, well, I mean, we always used to joke about the fact that there were no female guitar rock bands, and then suddenly, like buses, they all come at the same time, and we were painfully aware, partly because I think I tried to sign Elastica as well as Echo Belly, so they were kind of there was a little bit of people were beginning to ask questions as to whether there was whether I was having problems in my love life at the record label. But I remember talking about this with Lou, saying, well, people are going to say this shit. People are going to say this kind of sexist stuff, oh, it's another female fronted band. And I went to a shop in Soho, and I chose a really nice green, kind of almost military coloured T-shirt, and had them print another female fronted band on it. And I gave it to Lou just as a joke, really. And she wore it in a photo shoot. And and I think you can buy this T-shirt now, and you can go online and buy as worn by Louise Wenner, another female fronted band T-shirts. I think that's my finest creation, Mark.
Well, I mean, the thing that I was going to ask you a little bit about as well with the vinyl side to what was happening with Sleeper is the formats that we use. I mean, if you've seen the front of my little website I'm building for This Is Vinyl, I found an Indolent. There was a Sleeper 12-inch,
yeah.
I think. And I do remember at the time, having within Revolution, so we were pushing it out to club DJs, to regional press, to some regional radio, to students, to whatever, and that format game was quite important. So we had an awful lot of 12-inch records and 7-inch records and white labels, and I think again Steve and yourself were quite forward thinking in this about saying, well, let's make sure we get the right format for the right bit of media. So let's have the right format for the DJs, and working with people like themselves. It's kind of, well, what do they use? What do they want? Well, they want 12-inch records. Fine. How many do you need? Okay, 500. There you go. They'll be with you, week on Friday or something like that. And how important do you think? I mean, did you in the planning meetings, did you think in that way? Was it very much a kind of, we need to produce certain amounts of vinyl, because obviously CD was the format which was primarily in demand at the time. So what was your thinking about the vinyl?
It's really interesting, yeah. The idea of 90s vinyl. I mean, obviously when we did the first record, people were still buying vinyl, so it didn't seem like too much of a stretch to do smart on vinyl.
Yeah.
In terms of the club promotions, I don't think there was ever, despite the fact that clearly CD was the currency by that point, I think the main, the predominant format. I don't think it ever was. I don't think that club DJs ever had the kit, did they, that was sophisticated enough to play CDs. I might be wrong, but I think I don't even think. I mean, we did do CD promos, but they were largely for radio promo for our radio promo guy Alan James. But my understanding was that DJs, possibly not radio DJs, but certainly club DJs, were playing off vinyl, and obviously, we did do 7-inch promos as well. But clearly a 12-inch, the grooves are further apart and it just sounds better. So that's why we did,
Yeah.
that's why 12-inch promos. For me, I was just really excited to get, because I had the name for the label, and then I really wanted a good label logo.
Yeah.
And always sweating the small stuff, nothing that important for me apart from the design. So I wanted the label, I wanted the logo of Indolent to look a bit like its meaning. So I wanted it to look a bit lazy. So the designer came up with this idea of the dot of the eye just kind of falling off the side. But actually, when you look at that's not the message you get from it. For me, it looks a bit like the Impulse label or something like that for me. It has that sort of
Yeah.
that exclamation mark thing going on.
Did you do many remixes, or have DJs remix any of your artists on it?
Not initially. We did later on. I signed a band called W from Southeast London, and they did a 60 Foot Dolls remix actually. And we also did a fantastic 60, was it maybe one and the same actually, where going back to Carl Bevan, his dad, Ray Bevan, is an evangelical preacher in South Wales. And so we did a mix of a track called "Let the Spirit Move You," which was just a chant that Richard kind of came up with, and then mixed in Carl Bevan's dad doing a kind of sort of a rousing speech to the congregation, which was really good. But we didn't do a lot of mixes. I did a mix once around the final Sleeper album, which at this point had been various corporate shenanigans had kind of forced the band to release on RCA proper rather than Indolent, which not being the world's most politically minded of people, I didn't realize was the writing on the wall for me. But I did a mix of one of the fantastic tracks on the final album, which was a stiff actually, called Motorway Man, and I got Steve Osborne to do it was a really fantastic dance mix, and the band were very, very cross with me because we weren't communicating as well as we had been by that point. The days of giving Louise t-shirts and sort of talking to them deep into the night about Elvis Costello were long gone. Sadly, they would, that's what happens with groups. They become, they're like children. They grow up and they get legs and they go off and they have their own lives. And you can't be the A&R person that you were in the early days to them. Yeah, and that's so there's a just even saying that is an interesting chapter for my book, I think.
Yeah.
That's the one to write.
Never
Yeah,
thought.
so we didn't do, to answer your question, not many mixes. We did one, I think, with the Wannadies. We did a kind of Three Colors Red and collaborative venture where they I think mixed each other's songs. I think that's something that we did.
A recollection of that.
Mm.
The reason I sort of bring it up is because from our perspective as a promotions company, we were watching it almost from the other end. So you're sort of seeing how two cultures are starting to merge. So you've got your kind of your indie kids and then you've
Mhm.
got your dance clubs, and then you've got people like at the time the Dust Brothers, who later became the Chemical Brothers, kind of coming along,
Mhm.
and Cook and what have
Yes.
you know, him doing remixes for Corner Shop, for example, Brimful of Asher, and revolutionised that track. You know, that suddenly went from being a good tune on Ouija Records to suddenly, you know, uh, American charts, #1 in the UK. And this merge of these two cultures was getting to the
Mm.
point where the kids, the dance kids and the indie kids, started all going to the same clubs, and the DJs were
Mm.
starting to, you know, do remixes of indie band or the more independent guitar band tracks,
Mm.
and it was appealing to both cultures, and so you suddenly got the rise of this kind of alternative dance clubs, I suppose you would call them.
Mm.
And
Although that was, I mean, that was kind of, I think that kind of fusion had already been established in the early 90s with, you know, with people like Steve Osborne doing the Happy Mondays and yeah, kind of Kirsty MacColl kind of doing that Manchester EP. And so the fusion of the rock culture and dance culture. Obviously, the Stone Roses come into this, although I do think that their involvement with it is slightly exaggerated because it does effectively boil down to one record, doesn't it? You know, there's nothing dance culture-ish about the Stone Roses debut record, or indeed the second record, but it's just that Fool's Gold is, you know, in many ways encapsulates the idea of indie dance.
yeah, I mean that's again with for a vinyl junkie or a vinyl collector, you know,
Mm,
finding these things. So, I mean, I you know keep digging out promos that I keep finding because
mm,
there was a box of white labels I dug out the attic, and I don't know what's on them. I haven't marked them. You know, they're obviously
right.
came from Revolut, so I'm going to have to try and go through them and look at the catalog numbers to figure out
That's
what the hell.
exciting.
So you mentioned Costello a couple of times. I
Mm.
I remember John Stewart from Sleeper coming in very excitedly and saying, "You got to listen to this," and it was Elvis Costello singing "What Do I Do Now?" Um,
That's right.
and I was like, "How the hell did you get Elvis Costello to do a Sleeper song?" And I can't remember what he said. How did you get Elvis Costello to do a Sleeper song?
Well, I'd love to say it was all me and Elvis. We go back years, but no, I've never met him. What happened was he, you know, the mark of an ambitious uh, entertainer is that he realized that in order to kind of continue his pop relevance, he had to sort of give some kind of nod towards what was going on in the UK. And plus, he's got a history of being interested in contemporary pop music coming out of his own country, you know, whether it was you know, around the time of punk, obviously, and then producing the specials, and then, you know, increasingly, um, he definitely kind of moved into extolling the virtues of American musicians. But I think in the mid 90s, he kind of saw the Britpop thing maybe as the exciting new development in pop music that it was. I think also he was doing another album with he'd got the Attractions back together. So there was a little bit of perhaps he'd recognized the um the legacy of the stuff that he'd done with the Attractions and how it was impacting on what was going on in the UK. Anyway, long and the short of it is that back in those days, as you know, you needed lots of different B-sides for all the formats in order for you to potentially stand a chance of flogging the same single to one fan three times and
Yeah,
getting yourself into the lower regions of the charts. And so Warner's, in their wisdom, had the idea of him doing various covers of Britpop bands' work. The only other one I can remember is Lush. I think he did a version of a Lush song. I might be right in saying, but he did a number of these covers to um, to put on the B side of of whatever the, you know, I'm sounding incredibly rubbish and vague now, but to put on the B side of the single that was promoting that album that came out in the mid 90s. I think, was it All This Useless Beauty? I can't remember what it was, but it was one of the ones with the Attractions. And that's how it came about. And I just heard it, I heard a cassette of it, the band that, you know, we got it off Warner's. And then I think we approached, I think, am I right in saying that then Louise did, or the band did an Elvis cover
I
by
think, yeah,
return.
yeah, I think,
I don't think it was a reciprocal. It was meant as a reciprocal thing. It wasn't like, oh, you do one of mine and I'll do one of yours. I don't think so. I think he just was doing covers of bands that were happening at the time.
made you realize again what a great song that was as well, where you can hear two very different versions of it. Obviously, Sleeper's version, and then
Mm.
Elvis Costello puts his particular slant on it and slowed it right down, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful song in its pure form. It's great, and it's really
Yes.
listening to
Yeah.
artists like that, that doing the same thing. That was brilliant. Really.
Yeah. So that's a great. I mean, lyrically just brilliant. Tore up all your photos. Didn't feel too clever. Spent the whole of Sunday sticking them together. It's just a Yeah, absolutely nails it. And of course, we put the famous, or rather infamous Camden, ubiquitous Camden sighting. Gary Prosser was the cover star of that single. That's before he was Gary Prosser. He
Yeah.
was he was absolute. What a lovely fella he was. But he was really keen on getting a record deal. I seem to remember so keen that I would sort of spend evenings with him just chatting and then suddenly I'd find myself I'd agreed to some demo time. They had a song, what was a band called? I can't remember now. Ballroom. He had a band called Ballroom, and they had a song with the chorus of the song was, "We want to be famous, and who can blame us?"
But Ballroom used to hang out in the revenue offices all the time. It was kind of
Hmm.
around the time that we were in the middle of Camden, obviously, and I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure if you threw a stick down Camden High Street, you'd hit someone in a Britpop band. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, you'd certainly hit a member of Ballroom. That's for no. That's for sure.
Ballroom menswear were knocking around at the same time.
Mhm.
Ballroom in particular, I remember we had them in our mailing room some of the time, just kind of like, well, you want to come in here and do stuff. You can have a cup of tea, but can you stuff those envelopes at the same
Yeah.
time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't you put your own record in those mailers? But they were
I
great.
don't think they ever got a deal though, did they, Ballroom? I don't. I mean, they were so well connected.
I want to say that
And Gary was he was a star, but not at singing, I don't think. That wasn't his forte.
that wasn't his main thing. God.
Yeah.
So you're, I have it on a good authority. A little spy told me, called Mike Smith,
Mm,
that
mm,
that
mm.
you have a rather massive record collection, and that it's sort of it's starting to take over your life. Would that be fair?
Well, I'm not sure, the word massive record collection, I never think of it as that. Other people say it is massive. I mean, I think because people see it on Zoom calls like this, I should be doing it really. It's ironic that we're doing this Zoom call and I'm actually doing it from my kitchen next to my
And you can send me a photo of
fire pink flag poster. But
not
yeah, I'll send you a photo. There it is. Yeah, I'll send you a photo of it. But it's kind of, I like so many record collectors. I have those IKEA Kallax
yeah.
shelf units, sort of flanking one of the walls in the study. I haven't really counted them. How many do you get to a one Kallax cube? I don't know. Is it about 70 records or something like that? 60?
Around that, yeah, yeah.
So I don't know. Multiply that by 24, 24. I mean, it's certainly a few thousand records, and I've certainly never did that thing that lots of us of a certain age did, which was get rid of all my vinyl
Mm.
when CDs came along. I always liked the
I
records.
was the same. Yeah, I've carried my collection around with me since I was a kid, and it's just
Yeah.
every house I've gone to, it's just got slightly bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, mine's got bigger since we moved to Stroud, and that's partly coinciding with being just getting progressively more interested in records, which I was, when we were in London. I think I can pinpoint the time when I started rebuying vinyl, and it was in Broadway Market. What's the market just off London Fields? I think it's Broadway Market. And I used to go swimming in the Lido at London Fields with my friend from Walthamstow, and then we used to go for coffee in Broadway Market, and there was someone started selling secondhand vinyl there, and I bought a copy of uh, Down by the Jetty, and I think Road to Ruin. I bought a couple of copies of those, like, original pressings in really good nick. And I suddenly thought, fucking hell, I think I'm going to start collecting vinyl again. This is great. And that must have been around about 2011, 2012, and it gradually got the problem started there,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And to the point now, yeah, to the point now where I'm having to sort of really every few weeks go through the shelves and start pulling out stuff to just get rid of because I've amassed it, I mean, certainly I've always had a problem with charity shops not being able to walk past them.
Yeah.
I mean, they are hopeless for vinyl now, but pretty good for CDs. Some of them
Yeah.
very hard pushed to find anything of any interest, and even sometimes the context of a charity shop having something that isn't horrendously. I mean, I always call it optimistically priced.
Yeah.
I could say something more harsh, but
Yeah.
but I think optimistic pricing is definitely the game that charity shops are in.
I think some of them look at eBay and they use that as the marker. And we're above a charity shop, and I help the vinyl guy in there quite often. And this is a two-way
Well,
street.
that's good, Mark. I mean, I think the people who know about who are in the business of selling records or pricing records professionally, as opposed to a lot of the people who know about vinyl, who help out charity shops, who just know about looking up things on Discogs.
Yeah, that's right.
They generally give a fair price. Yeah, there's a guy called Steve who prices up the records for Stroud Auctions here. He's a lovely chap, and he's a big vinyl fan, and he volunteers at a charity shop out in Cheltenham. And if there's any vinyl comes through, it will be fairly priced, and he won't muck around sort of individually pricing singles. Everything will be 50p, and sometimes you can get some nice things there. But yeah, most charity shops actually, I almost have a sort of visceral physical reaction of anger and ire when I go in there. Still, I find myself going in there, which is terribly sad.
This podcast was presented by Mark Hobrough, produced by Swansfield Music. It was edited by James Gray for Kinetic Studios. Title music is Stoner Punk, published by Boost Music and Lift Music. Copyright 2024.